Not only are we going to name names, we're going to name a lot of names. Whoa! It's Todd Friel, boing! And I with my levitational power. So if you're here today and you thought, I can't be forgiven, I'm too bad of a sinner, you don't know how good of a Savior Jesus is. No matter who you are, no matter what you have done, where sin did abound, grace abounds that much more. Hello, and welcome to Wretched. My name is Todd Friel. I am your host, the wretch the song refers to. Today's special word is eugenics. It is alive and well today, but it didn't begin yesterday. It really began in the 1860s. We invite you to view a resource called What Hath Darwin Wrought at wretched.org/Darwin, and you will see the history of eugenics in America. The eugenics movement is not just today or Planned Parenthood or some sort of national genocide. It goes all the way back to the 1860s. Let me introduce you to the founding father of the eugenics movement. Name number one.
Francis Galton is considered the founding father of the eugenics movement back in the 1860s, when he wrote some articles that culminated in a book that he called Hereditary Genius. And part of the idea behind behind Hereditary Genius came to him while he was reading his cousin's book, The Origin of Species. Galton was Darwin's cousin. He began thinking about the effects of natural selection that Darwin was talking about in The Origin of Species on the human species, and how we could then help try to improve the human species by getting rid of these so-called unfit variants. And so in the late 19th century, Galton became the driving force behind pushing for an attempt to try to evolve humans to higher levels, to focus on those that had so-called better genetic traits. They didn't use the term genetics back then, that was unknown, but better hereditary traits, that would be the term they would use. And then to so-called weed out the ones that were considered inferior traits. Galton's ideas really caught on by the 1890s and early 1900s, not only in Britain, where he was from, but also in the United States. Galton claimed that his ideas came as he was reading Darwin's Origin of Species. And if you read the works of the early figures in the eugenics movement, almost all of them saw what they were doing as applied Darwinism. And Darwin himself, in The Descent of Man, who was already well aware of Galton's ideas that had been published some before he wrote The Descent of Man, which was published in 1871. Darwin himself discussed Galton's ideas. And although Darwin did not think that we should institute any kind of compulsory programs, government-run programs, in part because he didn't think that we had enough knowledge about heredity yet to be able to do things like that, he still does make the comment that he approves of a voluntary eugenics. That is, people who have bad hereditary traits just shouldn't marry and shouldn't procreate. So Darwin himself favored a voluntary kind of eugenics in his day.
If you're wondering the location of this interview with Dr. Richard Weikart, it's in Stockton, California. Right back about here was an institution where they sterilized people throughout the 20th century. 60,000 people sterilized between 1900 and 1960. Why? Because there was a philosophy, a worldview that had permeated every aspect of our culture. Social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, breeding up, getting rid of the misfits. But the eugenics movement didn't start in the 20th century. It started in the 19th century while Charles Darwin himself was alive. Francis Galton is name number one. We would like to introduce you to name number two. He's not a sofa, he's Charles Davenport.
Charles Davenport, who was the key eugenicist in the United States, was staunchly committed to Darwinian evolution. He founded a lab in Cold Spring Harbor in Long Island, New York, that was dedicated to studying eugenics and created what was called the Eugenics Record Office. But he also, his lab was known as the Center for Experimental Evolution. So evolution was right there at the core of much of the eugenics movement.
We had an office for eugenics. We see it today. It began years ago with those two men, but it continued and it flourished, especially up until 1940. Sterilizations all over the place, courtesy of name number 3, Clarence Darrow.
Clarence Darrow was the attorney that was arguing in the Scopes trial on the side of the Darwinists. And Darrow was very committed to not only Darwinism, but biological determinism, the idea that everything's determined by your heredity, or sometimes they could say environment to some degree as well. Darrow actually was not a staunch eugenicist, but he did promote euthanasia on the basis of his worldview. He did say at one point that we should kill the unfit. I believe in his particular case, he said chloroform them.
Right there, right behind that window. Eugenics performed in America in the 20th century. And that leads us to a very famous name, number 4, a Supreme Court justice by the name of Oliver Wendell Holmes.
Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. Was the Supreme Court justice who wrote the decision of Buck versus Bell in 1927. Holmes was a very staunch social Darwinist, and in fact, very interestingly, he later said that he thought this was one of his more important decisions, that this was really a foundation for what he thought would benefit human society. And the decision was to allow compulsory sterilization in the state of Virginia. That was the law that was being challenged before the Supreme Court. And he made a very famous statement that 3 generations of imbeciles is enough.
Carrie Buck, 3rd generation, a daughter of a woman who had mental health issues, whose mother had mental health issues. And Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, enough of that. 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. Please watch What Hath Darwin Wrought? It's free, courtesy of our gospel partners, wretched.org/Darwin. We'll introduce you to more names next on Wretched.
The heart of TMAI is to take the timeless truths and the timeless principles that are found in the Word of God and build those into men, indigenous pastors in those areas that know the language, that know the culture, to invest in them a training that they desperately need to pastor local churches.
Small investment, massive impact. Wretched.org/pastor. Welcome back to Wretched. The atheists celebrating this week because it's Darwin Day in America. Charles Darwin, the hero of so many atheists, because he supposedly provides a mechanism which allows them to suppress the obvious truth that God created the planet. While Charles Darwin may not have been a eugenicist, his ideas gave birth to the eugenics movement. What Hath Darwin Wrought? You can watch the whole episode. Please watch it with your kids. Features brilliant men like the fellow we're about to see, Dr. Richard Weikart, giving us the history of eugenics in America that began with the ideas of evolutionary science from Charles Darwin. We call it social Darwinism, applying the idea of survival of the fittest to the masses today. We have seen a number of names of the fathers of eugenics and some of its early proponents. Now let's fast forward a little bit, because if you think eugenics is no longer a part of American society, prepare to meet name number 5.
Former head of the Human Genome Project, James Watson, has been one who's been pushing very hard for the so-called new eugenics. He actually embraced the old eugenics all the way back in the 50s when he and Crick were working on the model of the DNA molecule, which they found and won Nobel Prize for.
Cool. Perhaps you're not familiar with the name James Watson, but I suspect you know this fellow. He's a professor. That's right. He's teaching young people Eugenics, not to be confused with Margaret Sanger. This is Professor Peter Singer.
And I would put in the forefront of that Peter Singer, who has an endowed chair in human values of all things at Princeton University, who is promoting the desanctifying of human life. That's actually the title of one of his books, Desanctifying Human Life. He's promoting the idea that we should open the doors to abortion, infanticide, euthanasia for the disabled on the basis of Darwinism, essentially. Singer doesn't talk about Darwinism a lot, but he does on occasions, and he makes clear that it's one of the underpinnings of his thinking about bioethics. James Rachels, who's actually one of the people that got me most interested in this very issue, his ideals are very close to Singer's. He's a philosopher also, bioethicist. He wrote a book called Created from Animals, The Moral Implications of Darwinism, where Rachels argues very forthrightly that Darwinism undermines the Judeo-Christian sanctity of life ethic. And Singer very clearly agrees with that. And he's not alone. There are many other people that are buying into very similar ideas in bioethics, devaluing human life because they think humans are simply animals that have evolved maybe a little bit higher than other animals, but still don't deserve any special treatment or special consideration.
Bringing man down to the level of animal. Peter Singer, since this interview with Dr. Richard Weikart, has said maybe we need to think about the option to end the life of a baby up to the age of 2. That is Peter Singer. That is eugenics. Where does it come from? There is a line that traces back all the way to the middle of the 19th century to a man named Charles Darwin, a well-kept secret. Charles Darwin was exceedingly racist.
Charles Darwin was clearly a racist. If you read his Descent of Man, he has a chapter on the races of man, in which he makes very clear that Europeans are superior mentally and even morally to other peoples. He clearly thought that the superior races were winning in the struggle for existence against the inferior ones. He interpreted European imperialism in that way. It was a matter of the struggle for existence where the better were prevailing.
What? Charles Darwin was racist? That Dr. Richard Weikart doesn't know what he's talking about. Well, if that's the case, then neither does Dr. John G. West.
Charles Darwin most definitely thought that there were higher and lower races. A lot is made these days of the fact that Darwin opposed slavery and that he was a kindly man. That's true, and we should all admit that. But what people are covering up is that he was also a just thoroughgoing racist. And it wasn't just residual racism. And it's true that there were other people who were racist. The most unique thing about Darwin, though, is that his whole theory was tied to his racism, and that he thought natural selection was actually provided a scientific explanation for why we should expect to find people of different mental capacities and different cultural capacities in different races. So it's not just that Darwin was a racist. Yes, there were lots of people who were racist at his time, but he thought natural selection acting on random variations provided a scientific justification for why we should expect racial disparities. And he also thought that his theory of evolution by common descent provided a good explanation for why you should have higher and lower races. And so he wrote about that. He thought, for example, blacks were the race that were the closest to apes.
Did you know that? The impact other scientists also applied their racist worldview.
After Darwin, you had scientists doing studies saying, well, look, we know natural selection produces people and animals with different capacities, so we should expect that among human races. So let's look and document just how unequal the other races are. You had people coming up with sort of like diagrams of human history trying to show how lower races evolved from the apes, and of course you needed to have a race that was sort of, what was the first race that sort of evolved from the common ancestor with the apes? Well, generally the Darwinists argued those were people in Africa. And if you look at the diagrams that were in many science textbooks at the time, that's exactly what they have. Interestingly enough, the science textbook used at the center of the Scopes trial, the infamous Scopes trial, had more on it about eugenics than just evolution, and it had a very clear section about human evolution that talked about basically whites are the crowning achievement of the race of the human race, whereas the other races were lower races.
If we're tearing down statues of racist people, maybe we need to pluck Charles Darwin, the racist, out of our science textbook. And just food for thought. When we return, we've saved the biggest name for last as we study the history of eugenics in America. Here comes a hint. And Germany next on Wretched.
Almost half of millennials watch absolutely no content on traditional TV platforms. Instead, millennials spend over 2 hours each day on their phones utilizing apps. Wretched is not only building an app, but we will also be invading online streaming services in an effort to reach your kids and your grandkids. Please, would you consider becoming a Wretched monthly gospel partner today? Let's reach millennials together.
These Bibles are not being delivered to your local Christian bookstore. They're going to far-flung places around the globe that are typically very, very, well, let's just say, pagan. Would you please help Bible League International to invade the globe with the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ by distributing Bibles for just $5 each? You can send a Bible to, well, say this fellow. You can do that at wretched.org/Bible. Welcome back to Wretched, taking a look at what hath Darwin wrought, which you can take a look at wretched.org/Darwin. You'll be introduced to Dr. Richard Weikart, and our next name, we all know it, don't we? One of the granddaddies of the eugenics movement, Adolf Hitler. Did Adolf Hitler ever talk about eugenics, especially connected to Darwinian evolution, in any of his speeches?
Oh, yes, especially in the speeches that he gave during World War II, which were sort of private speeches given to military officers. But there were public speeches, too. In Nuremberg in 1929, he made a very famous speech where he talked about the possibilities of eliminating, I forgot the exact figure, it was like in the hundreds of thousands of people could be eliminated, which would improve the human species, improve human heredity. In Mein Kampf, there's whole sections on eugenics as well. I don't remember the exactly course. I don't think in Mein Kampf he directly relates it to evolution, but again, you take in the context of the entire book, and he's definitely talking about social Darwinism and evolution in many other parts of the book. The section on eugenics is talking about improving human heredity. But he does connect it quite forthrightly with the struggle for existence and natural selection in many other places.
Ideas have consequences. Charles Darwin's evolutionary survival of the fittest idea, because I don't think it qualifies even for a theory, has had nasty impact throughout the 20th century. Perhaps Adolf Hitler, the greatest eugenicist of all time, exterminating 6 million Jewish people. Where did that idea come from? It came from Charles Darwin. Today, there are some people who suggest, well, Adolf Hitler, he was actually a Christian, so we're just going to hang that whole Holocaust thing on Christianity. Was Hitler a Christian?
Hitchens is not a historian, and most historians would not agree with that. There is actually one historian who's tried to paint the Nazis as being sort of some form of Christian, although he wouldn't say Catholic. He says, in fact, the one historian that argues most strongly that Nazis were Christian argues that, in fact, they were liberal Protestant, that was the way they went. But most historians see Nazism, correctly in my view, as being anti-religious. And certainly if you look at Hitler's private utterances about Christianity, especially Catholicism, he was extremely contemptuous of Christianity. So anything that we would sort of think of as being Christianity, he certainly didn't buy into that. In fact, my view is that Hitler was a pantheist. He very often deifies nature, and the way this works itself out in the connection of Darwinism is that natural law becomes really the highest arbiter of all ethics and morality. So the Darwinian struggle for existence, Hitler thought, whoever wins that is moral. They are the most moral people, and they have morality on their side.
Question: can we blame Charles Darwin for Adolf Hitler's World War II? Well, not exactly. Can we blame him? We blame Hitler, but that is not to suggest there wasn't a connection between Darwin and Adolf Hitler.
Look at his ethical system. It was not motivated in the slightest by any kind of Christian concerns at all. It was motivated by the struggle for existence. It was motivated by what he saw as an evolutionary ethic. And my book, Hitler's Ethic, lays out in incredible detail that story of how Hitler applied evolution to all facets of his policy and ideology. Not only the struggle for existence between nations, so you have warfare between nations as being one kind of manifestation, and so he's justifying offensive warfare by the need to gain living space. They ought to look at Hitler's table talks, where he talks about the issue of the relationship between faith and science. Because Hitler at one point in his table talks does very forthrightly engage that very issue and engage the issue of faith versus science. And in that table talk, he takes the side of Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and speaks very highly of them. And Frederick the Great, in fact, was one of Hitler's favorites because Frederick was an Enlightenment individual who pretty much scorned traditional religion.
Ideas have consequences. Evolution breeds racism, which breeds atrocities. There is another name that makes Adolf Hitler look like a choir boy. Her name is Margaret Sanger. She is the founder of Planned Parenthood. She was a racist eugenicist who thought it would be good if we kept a certain population. Lower numbers would be good. And sometimes she couched it with urban or inner city, but the reality is Margaret Sanger was not a fan of black people. That is why today, go find your local Planned Parenthood, and chances are it will be in an urban center that is predominantly black. Can we say that Planned Parenthood sits in a room smoking cigars? You know, Margaret wants us to kill all of the black people. We don't have evidence for that, but we do have evidence that Planned Parenthood clinics predominantly are in black neighborhoods. Abortion has killed more people in this century than died in the entire last century. And we can thank a man named Charles Darwin for it. When we return, a couple of names that will surprise you in our surprise segment, and one last name that you're going to say, hey, wait a second, I've heard that name before. Next on Wretched.
Hearing the heartbeat made me cry, and it was certain that I was going to keep my baby forever, and I cannot imagine my life without my happy, lovely, joyful, smart baby, and I'm so grateful.
Another ultrasound, another saved baby. For just $28, you could save the life of a child by providing a free ultrasound through preborn.org. How many babies could you save? preborn.org/wretched. The more people give to Wretched, the more Wretched gives away. I don't know why I'm talking actually like that in the first person, but that is our slogan. If we receive more support, we'll give away more things. 2019, giving away 250,000 copies of an evangelistic book, giving away resources like What Hath Darwin Wrought. The only way we can do things like that is courtesy of people like you who support us. We call you a gospel partner because we partner together in this endeavor to preach the truth. Would you please consider becoming a gospel partner? Wretched.org/donate. Yes, these kids are having a good time, but this is about a lot more than just dancing and singing. This is about the gospel. You're seeing a Tomorrow Club in action. Kids coming to hear the gospel be loved on by the team leaders. They're getting saved and they're bringing the gospel home to mom and dad. This is about a lot more than just fun. Would you please support your own Tomorrow Club at tomorrowclubs.org/wretched. Welcome back to a wretched surprise, naming names of eugenicists that were inspired by Charles Darwin, the racist. Do you remember all of the names that we have named? We're going to introduce you to two new names, but you're going to hear a familiar name in this surprise.
Dicky, Loeb, and Nathan Leopold were brilliant students in the 1920s, and they thought a lot of themselves. They thought they were enamored with Nietzsche's theory of the Superman. They sort of thought they were it, and they ended up committing what they hoped was going to be the perfect crime. It was a really horrific crime. It was killing a young boy in their neighborhood, someone who they actually had an acquaintance with, and murdering him and trying to get away with it as sort of the perfect crime. And the reason why the Leopold and Loeb murder is so important and was such a watershed is what happened when they were caught. Their families hired leading defense attorney Clarence Darrow to try to get them off the death penalty. The question wasn't about, they couldn't get off guilt because that was so overwhelming that they weren't going to try that, and they basically confessed. So they couldn't really take that back, but what they could try to do is spare them the death penalty. And Clarence Darrow, who was a thoroughgoing Darwinian, thoroughgoing determinist and materialist, made this impassioned plea that basically Leopold and Loeb were not responsible for their actions, because, especially in the case of Loeb, he argued, who's to blame for his machine being imperfect? Basically, eons of evolution had sort of somehow programmed into him and broken his machine, and that's why he did what he did. And so he wasn't to blame for what he did. It was biology and heredity that caused the problem. In the case of Leopold, he argued, it was his college professors who talked about Nietzsche who was to blame. It wasn't Leopold and Loeb. And so this was an impassioned plea that people weren't responsible for their actions because of really scientific materialism, and he actually succeeded in getting them off of the death penalty. And this then became replicated in criminology textbooks and sociology textbooks as a watershed case for the triumph of scientific reason over the superstitious view that people were actually responsible for their evil acts.
Ideas have consequences. Blaming Friedrich Nietzsche for their murder. Not sure I'd lay the blame at his feet, but maybe at the feet of one Charles Darwin, whose ideas have been used to perform atrocities beyond our imagination. Please watch all of What Hath Darwin Wrought, wretched.org/Darwin. Thanks to our gospel partners. It's free. Please watch it with your family because your kids should know those names. Let's see who won something, shall we? Congrats to Tara Benson. Reset for parents. It belongs to her. It could belong to you. Simply visit wretched.org. Subscribe to the free Wretched newsletter. And until tomorrow, go serve your king.
Thank you for spending time with Wretched, and thank you for your tax-deductible financial support that allows us to preach the amazing gospel. Wretched, amazing grace.